Hello, do I begin?
Yes. Uh, just a minute. I'll introduce you and then we can start, sir.
Hmm.
Okay. So, good morning, everybody. So, we are back with another virtual walk. Last time we had a walk with Chetan, sir. And this time we have Dr. Sharvir Dhongde presenting the rocket journey of Ajanta. So, as you all know, he is the convener of Intact Pune chapter and co-convener of Maharashtra chapter, professor at Dr. B.N. College of Architecture. And there's a lot to speak about him, but I'll not take much time. And we'll start with his presentation, his talk. And if you have any questions in between, you can just put them in the Facebook chat and we'll try to answer them at the end. So I hand over to Dr. Sharvia sir now to begin his talk.
Yes, thank you, Saurabh, and thank you for inviting me on this heritage walk. Uh, I'll talk about Ajanta today for about an hour or so, and I think it's better to see the slides rather than my face. So I would request Saurabh to just put the slides on the screen so that you enjoy the visuals more than it's better to look at the visuals than me. So Saurabh, you can
Yes,
actually put the slide on.
I've done that. Now only slides would be seen.
Okay.
I'll mute
Yeah.
myself
So
also.
okay. Okay. So uh, I wanted to say in the beginning that way back in 1819, there was a guy who was actually putting graffiti on the walls of a place where one should not put graffiti. Graffiti, as it is bad, but to put a graffiti on a historical place is bad enough. But this man's graffiti actually became quite remarkable because he was standing in a cave at Ajanta, which nobody knew. And he was the first one to reach there, uh, perhaps with the help of a local guide. Uh, have all sorts of romantic tales about who the local guide was and how they reached at Ajanta. But leaving that apart, he was standing in one of the caves and he was scribbling his name on one of the pillars in those caves. So, what he scribbled was John Smith, 28th Cavalry, 28th April, 1819. That's what his graffiti was. It is still there in Ajanta today, and it's across the chest of one of the painted Buddhas in a Chaitya cave. And that graffiti has become iconic because this was the person who actually reintroduced Ajanta to the whole world. Ajanta, which had gone into oblivion for more than 1500 or 1600 years, was rediscovered by this officer, and this journey of Ajanta for us starts from there. So it's 201 years now that we rediscovered Ajanta, and I think it's a good enough opportunity to kind of relook at what Ajanta is all about. So after John Smith, Sir James Alexander, a Scottish military officer and author, visited the caves in 1824 and he published a description about the paintings and the caves in the Transactions of the Royal Asiatic Society of Great Britain and Ireland. This was in 1829, and that incident onwards, I think Ajanta actually came to light for the whole world, and the whole world has actually been attracted to Ajanta ever since. So that's how the journey of Ajanta starts. This is the column where he actually scribbled his name across one of the Buddhas there. So it must have been around 1900 years or 2000 years ago when this story actually starts. And Gautam Buddha had long attained Nirvana, and his followers, the Buddhist monks, roamed in Maharashtra preaching their religion. and this was the time around first century AD, and they had set up some centers in Maharashtra. This was the time which is also called the Hinayan phase of Buddhism. Um, and they were preaching Buddhism. It was not a very popular religion then, but they were finding roots. So they would actually go to villages, settlements, try to preach their religion, and retreat to their monasteries in the monsoons. So the best places for the monasteries they found, especially in Maharashtra, were rock cut shelters or rock shelters, I would call them, in the forests away from the settlements because they wanted peace, because they wanted to contemplate away from the civilization. They found these spots better than any other spot near the civilizations. Slowly, these monsoon retreats started becoming more and more permanent so that they became centers of activity for the Buddhists. Two types of caves kind of emerged, and one was the type where they prayed, and the other where they actually stayed. This phase of Buddhism, as I said, was called the Hinayan Buddhism phase, where there was no idol worship. So they prayed to a stupa. They were very austere in whatever they did. So the caves that they started digging were also very austere. They did not have any decoration. Uh, they did have some painting, but very minimal. Uh, no ornamentation, no sculpture, no statuary. Hmm. So at Ajanta, these people dug around five caves. So caves 18 to caves 8 to 13 right now at Ajanta would roughly belong to the Hinayan phase. Uh, as I said, two types of caves were dug, uh, and they established this center at Ajanta. If we look at this timeline, you will see that the first activity. Can you read this? I don't know. The first spurt of activity is seen at Ajanta in the first century AD, which roughly coincides with the Satvahan period in Maharashtra. So Satvahan period is the beginning of the activity at Ajanta, and slowly these Buddhist monks or the Buddhist monks could establish their religion. They could also find royal patronage. They found support with traders, especially traders who supported Buddhism monetarily. So that most of these caves that came about were on trade routes, so that the patrons who were traders could stop at these places. The traders also funded their activity. So slowly over the next 3 or 4 centuries, Buddhism developed in Maharashtra, and around the 5th century, which now is roughly called the Mahayana phase of Buddhism, a second spurt of activity actually started taking place in Ajanta. This activity was largely supported by the Wakatak kings and especially Harishain, who was one of the royal family members and also a vassal of the Wakatak kings, uh, funded some of these caves. All the later caves, Ajanta has around 29 caves. So all these later caves were dug in this later Mahayan phase. Uh, yeah. So of these 29 caves, five are Chaitya caves and the rest are Vihar caves. Now, these Mahayan caves are a bit different than the earlier Chaitya caves that were dug. What is different? What is the difference between them? One is that by this time, the Buddhists actually had dug caves in a lot of other places, and they had some experience of digging caves. And earlier problems with the caves, especially problem of light reaching the inner parts of the caves, was better resolved in the Mahayan caves. So Mahayan caves had better lit interiors so that sunlight could reach inside. They had better volumes, better arrangement of rooms inside. Mahayan caves also were better decorated. By this time, decoration was kind of allowed in Buddhism, and sculpture was allowed, painting was allowed, and most importantly, representation of the Buddha in the idol form was kind of permitted in Buddhism by this time. So a lot of these caves have elaborate statuary, and you find Buddha in various poses in a lot of these caves. Along with the Buddha, Buddhist, if you call it mythology, had developed by this time. And so you have a lot of other characters as well, the Yakshas, Yakshinis, Taras, Bodhisattvas, who were also depicted in these caves. So these caves, if you see the plan, it has become a complex of around 29 caves now. This is in the 5th century. And a lot of us think that this huge complex must have taken a lot of years to construct, to build. I wouldn't say even construct, to dig and to be created in the way it stands today. But actually, Walter Spinks, who is an authority on Ajanta, is considered an authority on Ajanta, has kind of through various sources uh, kind of proposed that all this activity, which resulted into these caves in the Mahayan period, would have been restricted to a period of 35 years or two generations uh, for that matter. So, in a very short span of 35 years, this huge complex of caves at Ajanta actually took shape. This is during the Vaka Takrin, as I said, and it must have been a very intense activity because to do all that work in 35 years, 2000 years, 1500 years ago, uh, is some big job. Now, cave digging, if we look at the activity of cave digging, is not a very simple activity. It's a very complex activity, especially when you don't have all the technology that is available to you today. So, what's challenging in digging a cave? So, let's understand that first. Uh, First, when you are building, you're actually assembling components to enclose a void or enclose space. When you are actually digging a cave, you are inside a solid and carving out the solid to create space. That's the biggest difference in actually building and digging. So what you have to imagine is not a structure, but you have to imagine the void inside a solid. So that's the basic difference of how a designer imagines a cave. Uh, so how does cave digging start? You select a site. Obviously, the site at Ajanta is very, very picturesque, as you can see from this picture. It's actually at a horseshoe bend of the Wagura River. It's a small river, and all these caves at that time would have had the access to a river through steps. So individually, these caves were connected to the river, and now that we have a path which takes us from one cave to the other, but that would not have been the case then. Each cave would have been independently accessed from the banks of the river. Yeah, so this site is selected, it is cleared of vegetation, etc. So you clean up the site. Then what you do is create a scarp in the hillside. So hillsides rarely are very straight. So you have to make the basalt straight or make it into a scarp so that you have a surface to work on. So you create that surface first. Then you emboss or you trace an elevation of the cave on this scar. So first, the elevation has to be kind of drawn on this scar, on this rock, into details, uh, exactly marking the positions of the entries, the windows, etc. This is very, very important because it is through these entries that the rock cutters would start chiseling inside the cave, so that as to start digging into the rock and making a cave. So through these entries, the first rock cutters kind of made an entry to the cave. Now, as the rock cutters go inside digging the cave, the work on the facade has already started simultaneously. So that the facade sculptures, the facade features, the finishing of the facade, the decoration of the facade happens simultaneously as the cave is in the process of digging. So there are two activities going on simultaneously, and there are two or three types of different stone workers that are working on the cave simultaneously. One type of worker is just a labor who is chiseling rock away, and huge quantities of rock, if you can imagine how much rock has to be taken out to form this cave. So there is one type of worker who is chiseling this rock. There is another type of worker who is kind of giving a rough cut. So while chiseling, you have to be very careful. The designer has to be very careful of telling where to chisel and where to not chisel, because you have to leave parts of rock intact where you want to introduce your elements like, say, columns, beams, brackets, walls, lintels, whatever. So all these elements that you see inside the cave. Yeah. So if you imagine digging this cave, all the columns here have to be left in place, and things between the columns have to be dug out. Hmm. So the second type of worker kind of starts giving a cut to these elements that are left. And the third kind of worker, who is a much skilled worker, actually ornaments or finishes each of these elements. So there are three kinds of workers working simultaneously. Now, how do we know this? There are a few unfinished caves not only at Ajanta but in most of the cave complexes that you will see in Maharashtra and elsewhere as well. Uh, there are unfinished caves which give us a clue of the process of cave making. So you will find caves that are half finished, left halfway for various reasons, which actually will indicate how the process would have taken place. Now, why would somebody leave a cave half finished? See, again, cave digging, as I said, is a risky business. It's not an easy thing to dig a cave. As I said, if you can imagine, the facade is already being made, and the chiselers are actually going inside the cave, chiseling this rock out. Now, you are never sure of what kind of rock you are going to encounter inside the hill. From the outside, you have estimated that this rock would be solid from inside, monolith, but quite possibly you might find a crack in the rock or a fault in the rock or perhaps water seepage in the rock which you can't live with, which becomes dangerous for the survival of the cave. Hmm? So that either you have to change the design of the cave such as to avoid that crack or seepage or fault in the rock, or sometimes you have to abandon the work completely. Now that's a very what unfortunate incident to happen, because you have finished the facade of the cave, you have finished perhaps half of the cave, and now at the end, when you know that the rock has a problem, you have to kind of you have no choice but to abandon that cave. So you find such abandoned caves even in Ajanta, half finished abandoned caves even in Ajanta. Uh, yeah, so it's a very challenging job to actually dig a cave. And the volume of these caves, if you can imagine from this picture or the next picture I'll show, the volume of these caves is huge. So that much amount of rock has actually been chiseled with hand chisels and taken out. You can imagine this with machines. You know that boring a tunnel takes so many months even today, perhaps years, and this is all hand and chiseling work. So to take that amount of rock outside the caves to create these spaces inside has been a tremendously laborious job. Now, the two caves that I showed you, this earlier one and the second one, also contrast a lot in the kind of finish that they have. The first one, this one, is a Hinayan cave. As I said, the Hinayan caves were much simpler, austere, no ornamentation, very functional kind of spaces. This is also a Chaitya cave. This is cave number 10. So this is one of the early caves in Ajanta. And the Mahayan cave, which is this cave number 26, it's again a Chaitya cave, but you see the amount of decoration that this cave has. So there is a stark difference in the way interiors were treated in the Hinayan and the Mahayan phases. You can also see the Buddha on the stupa. uh, I'm sorry, I don't have the earlier stupa picture, but that stupa would not have a Buddha, it would be a plain stupa. So the Buddha is also shown in a human form in the Mahayan caves. So there is a big difference in the way interiors of Mahayan caves were done in contrast with interiors of Hinayan caves. Uh, okay, now I think we should start talking about the paintings because paintings of Ajanta are almost synonymous with Ajanta. Interestingly, when I was looking at some of the sites of paintings, what I saw that even today, Ajanta paintings are a big draw in the art market. So I saw replicas of paintings or other prints of photographs of paintings being sold for thousands of rupees in all these auction sites. Uh, and this is not the first time that this is happening. But as far as I remember, I read somewhere that in 1924, uh, for 1,000 pounds, an actual piece of the paintings ripped off from Ajanta was sold in London. So it has lured people from the art world since then. Uh, yeah, before I go to the paintings, I had one more point to make. When I was talking about the caves, one should also imagine that an architect or a designer of spaces uh, needs to imagine a space. And for that, he needs a model to imagine it something like. And what do you imagine a cave like? I mean, if you haven't actually made a cave, what do you make it like? That's the question of the designer for it for eternity. And what the Ajanta cave diggers actually did was they looked around what was available at that time and they looked at the built structures that were made in the cities and towns of that time. And this painting at the left hand corner actually shows a built structure. It's from one of the Ajanta paintings. So if you look at the roof, uh, and the window in the roof. And if you look at what the cave makers in Ajanta have already done to the Chaitya cave, you will see that there is a very striking similarity in the kind of buildings that were being built at that time and the kind of features that the cave had. So, what the sculptors, the cave makers were doing is actually copying structures from the built environment around them into stone. So, these buildings which were being built were actually timber buildings. They were made of wood, perhaps brick and wood. So these timber roofs, timber rafters, timber elements of the structure were copied as it is in stone when caves were made. So if you look at the picture below of that window of the cave, you will find that you will see rafters below that window, which are copies of wooden rafters in the actual buildings. The picture on the left, the picture on the right also shows you a kind of a mandap, a porch, where a couple is sitting. And you can compare that with the picture below, which is the portico for one of the caves in Ajanta. And the resemblance is very, very striking. And one you can easily predict or easily say that the cave is actually exactly copying what the timber structure in the real world of that time would have been. So the timber structures of that time served as models for the cave makers of Ajanta to make their features from. So in the caves, you will see a lot of times. Uh, yes. Now, if you look at this cave and you look at the ceiling, especially, you will see those rafters which are done in stone. Actually, you don't need these rafters. For that matter, you don't even need the columns. Hmm? Because in a cave, the mountain rock is so huge that your cave is a minuscule hole in that whole rock, and you don't need to support that hole from inside with columns. So the columns that are left here have no structural role. They don't need to be there at all. You could remove the columns and that would actually do nothing to the cave. Structurally, it wouldn't fall. So the columns, the beams, the brackets, the ribs, etc., are all there just as a reference to what the timber structures of that time looked. Hmm. So you have to have familiar interiors, hmm, and these caves actually replicated those familiar timber interiors of that time into stone. So it's a direct translation of timber architecture of that time into stone. So it's also a record because timber architecture has completely vanished. We don't even know what the structures of that time actually looked like. But this will provide us an exact replica of what timber structures of that time would have been. Yeah. So one more example, as I said, the picture on the left will show you beams and then joists and even smaller joists to support the ceiling above as if it's a timber structure. You can try and imagine any timber structure that you have seen, and the ceiling would have exactly looked like this. This the only difference is this is in stone and it's totally ornamental. It's not structural at all. Yes, but this visual continuity, I think, was very important to those builders to kind of feel that they were in buildings that they knew about. The picture on the right shows an unfinished cave, and that would actually give you an idea of how caves were cleared out while things were done simultaneously of finishing the columns, rough cut of the brackets, etc., etc. So the floor is still having a live rock, which has to be dug out so that it could be made plain. Yeah. So we come to the paintings again. I was talking about these paintings being very, very popular even today. Uh, yes. Now, why are these paintings so popular? Perhaps Ajanta paintings are the first examples of classical Indian art. Now, when I say classical Indian art, I mean that whatever art followed in India after Ajanta kind of shares its features with what is seen at Ajanta. So that Ajanta becomes a precursor to what follows in the world of art in India, not only in India, but in neighboring countries of, say, Sri Lanka, Java, Sumatra, then Indonesia, Thailand. So all these countries actually kind of followed the kind of art that Ajanta practiced. Now, when I say classical Indian art, there are some characteristics that one can attribute to classical Indian art. And these characteristics, I would say, are one is ideal body proportion. So this is one of the characteristics of Indian art. So I'll just run through a few slides while I'm talking, and you can relate to what I'm saying through these slides. So, ideal body proportions is one of the features of classical Indian art, of how good art should be. Depiction of various emotions. So, depicting an emotion becomes very important in Indian art. So, these are not square faced, mechanical, kind of all similar looking characters, but they display emotions, the human emotions that we all go through in our lives are kind of depicted in this art. So, depiction of these emotions becomes very important. Beauty and grace, that's an essential characteristic of Indian art. So it has to be, whatever you draw has to be beautiful. So even if it's a yaksha or a dwarf or a rakshas or an old woman or an old man or whatever monk, the painting has to look beautiful and graceful. Hmm? So that's an essential character of our art. It is essentially also realistic in nature. So that's another characteristic of Indian art, that it is realistic. So it's not abstracted. So you don't have triangles, or say Warli art, for example, is abstracted art. So you have triangles for human beings, right? But here, the art is realistic. So humans are depicted in the human form. All the clothes that they wear, the jewelry, etc., the hairstyles that they have are all near to reality. So realistic depiction of whatever is seen or whatever is drawn is an essential feature, and the variety in color and shade. Hmm. So, shading using appropriate color at appropriate places, highlighting so that you have a 3D effect, an effect of depth, an effect of elevation. So that those are the characteristics of classical Indian art, and all these characteristics are very, very what pronounced in the paintings at Ajanta. Uh, Now, again, it is not only the beauty of these paintings at Ajanta that is of importance, but the subject matter of these paintings. What are these paintings depicting? Hmm? That is also very important. Now, in Ajanta, you see that there is a vast range of subjects covered by these paintings. So, subjects would range from, say, everything that happens in one's life. So, right from childbirth to sufferings of old age, you see in Ajanta. From intimate moments of a couple to moments of separation, and the pangs of separation very vividly seen on the faces painted there. From coronations to renunciations of the world. So there is a huge range of subjects that the paintings at Ajanta have kind of covered. Um, then there is a huge range of characters. Meaning if you just start looking at who is painted on these cave walls, you will see kings, you will see queens, their attendants, jesters, you will see teachers, you will see monks, you will have dancers, you will have musicians, you also have foreigners. Hmm? So I'll show you a picture where you also have foreigners, you have common people. So you have everybody that you can think of in the society at that time who gets a place in these paintings. So this range of characters is huge. And these are not only real characters, but there are characters like, say, Gandharvas or Yakshas, which are imaginary characters. And then there is a code which these artists have developed of how to show these imaginary characters. So that there is almost a rule book of how to show a Gandharva, how to show a Yaksha, or how to show a Rakshas. So there is a range of these characters from real world to imaginary. Then there is emotion. Hmm? Uh, if you look at these faces, you will know that there is emotion. There are people in distress, people who are kind of thinking, people who have kings who have renounced the world and leaving, a queen who is trying to entice her husband, somebody doing makeup, getting dressed. So there are a lot of these emotions and activities depicted, and you also have a lot of other stuff at the background, but which is nonetheless very, very important, is the architecture that you see, the palaces, the houses, the furniture, especially the jewelry, the costumes, different hairstyles, everybody nearly uh, in accordance with their character, have different hairstyle. So different kinds of hairstyles. Now the battery low, I think this is connected. No? So different kinds of hairstyles in keeping with who the person is. Costumes, jewelries, as I said, skin color. Now everybody is not the same skin color. So it's a realistic depiction, as I said, of what the real world is about. So there is a huge variety in that as well. Uh, so the whole kind of society is reflected in the paintings here. So it's almost as if Ajanta is documenting the society, the social order of who sits where does the king sit, where does the attendant sit, where does the queen sit, who is away from the king, who is near the monk, where does the monk sit. So this whole hierarchy that you have in society, the social order of that time, is also reflected in these paintings. So the whole life of the people, as if it's a documentary of that society. So Ajanta is almost, as I said, a social document of the period, and so it's very, very important for us. And it doesn't only show people, but at the same time, it shows animals as well. So there is a spirituality in these paintings as well. So animals also are seen going through the same kind of turmoil in life that people have in theirs. So there is a worldly life, there is a spiritual life, there is a life of the flora and the fauna. Uh, yeah, so Ajanta elephants, I'm sure you must have seen, they are very, very well known. So you have elephants, you have horses, you have swans, you have deer, you have horses, bulls. So all kinds of flora and all kinds of fauna are depicted in these paintings. Even the blooming of flowers, different kinds of flowers, the wilting of the creepers, the sprouting of leaves, you name it, what you see in nature, and you have it painted in Ajanta. So it's a magnificent kind of document of the world around Ajanta at that time, or the world at that point in time, I would say. Not only human world, but the world of the flora and fauna as well. So that's why Ajanta is important, because you have a consolidated document of a period in these captured in these paintings at a single place. You look at this crown of Vajrapani. Uh, I didn't talk about Padmapani, but I'll perhaps look at the kind of detailing that goes into the crown on his head. So all these details of jewelry, if you look at necklaces of different people, uh, you will find that there is a huge amount of variety that you will find in the ornaments that the people, especially the ladies, are wearing. And I mentioned foreign guests. This is on the ceiling of Cave 1, and is believed to be the Iranian king Khushru and his wife Shirin, who would have perhaps visited at the time of King Pulakeshi. So one is not very sure whether he is really Khushru and Shirin, because the dates somehow would not match. But there is an Iranian for sure, and there is a foreign guest, and this is not the only one. There is one more which shows a foreigner. So there is, as I said, it's a variety. So one can imagine the kind of repertoire that these artists had, and what mastery they would have had on their art. If you look at this ceiling, it's a ceiling painting, and one could imagine that, as I said, caves were dug by the chiselers, and then the finishing kind of people, artists, came along with them as they dug inside. And one would imagine it's a ceiling, it would have been at a certain height. An artist would have to actually lie down on his back, or perhaps look up, crane his neck up to actually make this. And to make those perfect circles and that intricate pattern on the ceiling is not a very easy job. And these are very, very dimly lit interiors. You hardly have light inside. So to execute that painting on the ceiling with such a perfect geometric pattern, I think the artist must have been master artists of that time. So who were these artists? Where did they come from? Would be a natural question that one would ask. And there are various takes on who these artists were. One thing everybody has kind of said surely that these artists were Indians. uh, it's not that artists were visiting from some place outside or were imported from some place outside and they did this job and went away. No, they were very, very Indian. The school or the training, perhaps, the kind of painting that they executed here, perhaps as an influence of the Bactrian Greeks. So that might be one of the influence. Or people have also said that the school would also be very, very similar to the Naga artists of Kashmir at that time. So there are these various influences that people have pointed to, but everybody very, very emphatically has said that these are Indian artists who have executed. And one can imagine from the understanding of the people, the characters, as I said, what they are doing, how they are dressed up, the emotions that they display, the faces that they have. A foreign artist is very unlikely to capture all that in a painting. So it has to be an artist uh, is who belongs to this place. Uh, the sculptural style is called the style at that time which was practiced is called the Gandhar style of sculpture. So pan India, if I kind of place Ajanta in the timeline, it's the late Gupta period in India. And this Gandhar school, which was definitely influenced by the Bactrian Greeks, uh, was a popular style of sculpturing, making this statuary. And important characteristic or the distinguishing characteristic of this style uh, is, if you look at the sleeping Buddha in cave 26, is the very minute details of the fabric. If you look at the hand of the Buddha, you can feel that the cloth of his dress has those pleats. Hmm? Then the neckline actually suggests the dress that he is wearing. And if you look at the cushion that he rests his head on, it's slightly pressed below his head. So all these small details of fabrics are a very prominent characteristic of the Gandhar style. So this statuary is in the Gandhar style of sculpture. Uh, One more thing I should mention about the paintings, as I did with the rock cutters as well, that there are two or three different kinds of painters who are involved in making these paintings at Ajanta. One would be the line drawing artists who would actually do the outline drawings on the surface. The others would be apprentices who would fill in the base colors. Hmm? So basic coloring would be done by the second set of lesser trained artists, and the master artists would actually then do the outlines, the faces, the details, the emotions, the eyes, lips, etc. So all these details would be done by master artists. So to think of it, they are collective paintings. So it's not about one artist or a set of artists who have executed those paintings in totality. And typical to Indian art, this art is also anonymous. So you don't associate any name with these paintings. So the artist remains anonymous. So it's almost like it's a collective work where no one artist can claim what credit for that. So it's a very typically Indian characteristic, I would guess. Same as with architecture as well, sculpture as well. So it's an anonymous kind of a creation. Uh, Now that also brings us to a question of what were they painting? As I said, they painted all these people, incidents, etc., etc., etc. But doing what? So the subject matter of these paintings at Ajanta, as you all know, comes from the Jatak tales. Uh, Now, these Jatak tales are tales about the previous life of Buddha. So, I'll talk about the Jatak tales in a short while, but I'll just say that these are tales of previous lives of the Buddha when on his path of attaining what enlightenment. So, when you paint a story, these are stories which are painted on these walls. One would imagine how we are used to looking at graphic novels today that incidents happen or are depicted one after the other. So, a story has a linear progression in the way it would be depicted in a picture. So, incident one will precede incident two, will precede incident three, so that there is a chain or a linear kind of arrangement of scene one, scene two, scene three, scene four. But that's not how things happen at Ajanta. This cave interior will show you that the whole walls of these caves, uh, this is cave 16, but even cave 1, cave 2, which are full of paintings, the whole walls of these caves are painted. And these are stories painted there. So it's very exciting actually to go and see these. But as I said, stories don't appear like a comic strip story. So incident one does not precede incident two, and it does not actually precede incident three. The way they are composed is very unique. What the artists have done is in a story, things take place at different locations. So perhaps you have things happening in a palace, then you have things happening in a forest, and then perhaps you have things happening in a monastery. So there are various locations where this story actually takes place. And all the incidents of one location are kind of clubbed together and put at one place. All the incidents of other location are clubbed together, irrespective of when they happen, and clubbed at the other place. And the all incidents of the third location are clubbed together and put at a third place, so that there is a spatial what distancing between the palace and the forest and the monastery. So it's perhaps to get that effect as well, that something happened here and then something happened there. So there is a spatial separation between the two. So everything in the palace is all painted together. So it might be scene 1 and scene 6 and scene 21 all put together because all of them happened in the palace. So perhaps at the right hand corner of this wall, you might have all the scenes from the palace, and the left hand corner would have all the scenes in the forest. So that's how they are sequenced. So there is no logical linear progression of these paintings. Then, so it's very, very difficult. One can imagine that if you don't know the story, you cannot decipher the story from the painting. So you have to know the story first and then appreciate the painting. People obviously whom the paintings were made for, that is the monks, would have known the Jatak story. So these paintings made sense to them. So they actually revealed what the story was to them. But now, for us, you have to read the story first and then go and understand what the painting is about. So unless you know the Jatak tales, it's pointless to go and visit Ajanta. So read a Jatak before, if you have to understand the paintings at Ajanta and not just look at them. So knowing the story is very, very important. One more thing that I need to mention about the technique of these paintings is usually a painting has a perspective, hmm, so that there is a vanishing point, that things that are behind appear smaller, those in the front appear larger, etc. So that there is a perspective effect. Uh, Indian miniatures don't have them, but this is very different from a perspective drawing as well as the technique of an Indian miniature. It kind of has what is called a multiple perspective, so that the effect is such that you, from wherever you look the painting, it looks as if you are a part of the painting. The things are happening around you, so the painting kind of doesn't look as a static composition, but it keeps on changing as you move on, looking at it from one place to the other. So kind of the viewer is involved and becomes a part of the painting. Also, for this effect, one has to stand at a distance of not less than 7 feet from the painting. If you go up close to the painting actually would not make sense to you, because the painting again, as I said, is not a comic strip, so it does not have a box where you have one incident painted in a box. Incidents, characters from one flow into the other. Hmm? So you don't know where one scene ends and the other scene starts, and so you would perhaps you would not be able to recognize whether a character or a feature or a piece of furniture is from one scene or the other. So from a distance, you actually get to see these demarcations or feel these demarcations, and the paintings start making sense. So this is how you are supposed to look at the paintings of Ajanta as well. So it's a very different technique from what paintings of today are. Now, let me check the time of what I should do. It's 11:21. Uh, I'll do one thing very quickly. I just wanted to, before I go to the Jatak tales, I want to end with a Jatak tale, but before that, I'll also talk a very small, for a very small time about the conservation of these paintings. Now, these paintings, or Ajanta for that matter, as I said, came to light or became known to us only 201 years ago. Hmm. And in these 201 years, the paintings have really suffered a lot, much more than they had suffered in the 1500 years of oblivion that they were in. So perhaps the forest protected them much better than what we have been able to do. So why is this deterioration happening? One is that, as I said, the paintings are very, very fragile. Uh, I'll just take 2 more minutes to also tell you how these paintings are made, because that's also very important. Uh, now, quickly, the stone surface of the caves is applied with 2 coats of plaster. It's a mud plaster made of very finely cut and thrashed hay, dried grass, and some plant material. So all this is mixed with mud in a paste, uh, a very fine paste of mud. And the first layer over stone is a coarse layer, so it's not finished. But the second layer is a much finer layer. It's in level, it's smooth, which is around say 2 or 3 mm thick. So it's a very thin layer. And then the surface, this is the surface that is provided for receiving the paintings. Now, on this surface, before the painting is made, you apply a coat of either lime or porcelain. So that gives you a background to paint your painting on. When lime is wet, you can paint on lime, but Ajanta actually does not do that. When you paint on wet lime, the technique is called a fresco technique. So a lot of times Ajanta paintings are called Ajanta frescoes, but it's a misnomer because frescoes are done on wet lime. Hmm. These paintings are done when the lime, and this has actually been what concluded by testing the lime samples for any pigments. So if lime was wet, the pigments would have actually absorbed by the lime. But that's not what has happened in Ajanta. The paintings have been done after the layer of porcelain or lime has dried. Hmm. So various pigments have been used for the paintings. The dominant colors are the reds, the orange, yellow, ochre, browns, green to a certain extent, and very exclusively a blue, which comes perhaps from the lapis lazuli, which is a precious stone. So this is the color palette which is used. The topmost layer, as I said, of the painting and the lime together is not more than 1 mm in thickness. So it's not a very thick coat of painting that you have. It's a very thin coat. And so it deteriorates very fast. So coming back to deterioration, it deteriorates very fast. The gum in the painting or the paint has started losing its adhesive properties and the paintings have started flaking. There are other problems as well. Dust, dirt, grime, as we say, has formed a coat on these paintings, which has almost translucent, so making these paintings obscure, and it's very difficult to remove that layer of dirt and dust. Humidity is another problem. Humidity, even from the number of visitors visiting these caves and breathing inside the caves. So one can imagine, or one can say that it's becoming very finicky. But no, the humidity of too many visitors through their breathing actually poses a problem to these paintings. Seepage is another problem. Fungal growth is another problem. Smoke and general air pollution. So now buses are not allowed near the premises. So all that pollution is also a big problem. So problems exist and they have to be solved. Problems existed earlier as well. So I'll just quickly talk about some of the very early attempts at preserving these paintings. Way back in the 19th century, I think it was James Ferguson's campaign to save these fragile pieces of work that initiated the first action. James Ferguson kind of lobbied a lot with the East India Company, uh, and the East India Company appointed Major Robert Gill of the Madras Army to make exact facsimile copies of these paintings so as to document the paintings of Ajanta. This guy, Robert Gill, was very patient, I should say. For 20 years, 20 long years, he copied each and every painting at Ajanta to its last detail. 27 of his canvases uh, uh, were displayed at the Crystal Palace in South London, Sydenham. This is in 1844. Hmm. So you can imagine Ajanta was almost inaccessible at that time. So 20 years this guy labored and documented everything at Ajanta, and he made these canvases which were displayed at London. Unfortunately, as you all know, the Crystal Palace burned down and these paintings were destroyed. But this man, you have to really appreciate this guy. He returned to Ajanta to resume his work afresh. This time he also came with a camera, and some of his pictures still survive. He could not resume work a lot because in a year he died. But that, I think, was the first humongous effort that somebody did to kind of document Ajanta. Then in 1872, uh, John Griffith, I'll display one of the pictures taken by Robert Gill. So when he returned for the second time, these are some of the pictures. I'm just displaying one. This is one of the pictures. See, this is the state of the caves he found them in when he started painting them. So you can imagine the effort he took for 20 years to document each and every part of these caves. Then in 1872, John Griffiths, who was then the principal of JJ College or JJ School of Arts in Mumbai, at the insistence of the government of Bombay then, took upon the work which Gill had started. And he, with his students, obviously had the advantage of having students from his college. And for 10 years, they documented Ajanta and made around 300 plates of these paintings. These plates were published in 1896 as a catalog, and that's the biggest record that anybody made of Ajanta. Then the Nizam's department, because Aurangabad and Ajanta fell into the Nizam's dominion then, Nizam had an archaeology department, which is very, very, what, uh, not surprising, but praiseworthy, I would say, to have an archaeology department at that time. So the Nizam's archaeology department in 1920 spent around 30 lakhs for the conservation of these caves. What had happened was when Gill was recording these paintings, to save them, he had applied a layer of varnish on the paintings, and varnish obviously becomes problematic. So to remove the varnish was a big enough task, and the Nizam's archaeology department, along with Italian experts, experts from Europe, took on this task, and then they slowly removed this varnish. They used shellac and alcohol and gum dammer and a spatula to actually beat back the paintings which were kind of tearing apart from the surface. So they did a conservation effort again, which had its own problems, but we'll not go into the details of that. And then Ghulam Yazdani, who was the director of the Nizam's archaeology department, made a photographic survey of these caves in 1923. Uh, then, obviously, after independence, ASI took over and extensive repairs were made. Even stonework was repaired. The problems with the paintings still continue somewhat, but yeah, I won't go into, as I said, into the details of that. And today, with Japanese aid, there is also a lot of conservation work happening at Ajanta. Now that Ajanta has been inscribed by the UNESCO as a World Heritage Site, a lot of aid from international agencies, especially the Japanese, is available for the conservation of these paintings. So with that, I'll come to the end part of this lecture, so which is about the Jatak tales. So what are Jatak tales? So just a moment, let me check time. It's 1 hour already, so I'll very quickly go over this, so I don't want to exhaust you with all that I have to say. So Jatak tales are, as I said, tales of the previous births of Buddha. There are around an estimated 550 Jatakas. So it's impossible for any of us to know all of them. Uh, so I think it's difficult for us to understand the paintings anyways. But yeah, the Jatakas have a very peculiar pattern of telling a story. Uh, these stories are about the experiences of a bodhisattva, or which is the soul on the path of enlightenment. So he is not, it is not an enlightened soul, he's not a Buddha yet, but he is a bodhisattva or a Buddha in the making. So these are stories of these bodhisattva and how they learned different values in their previous births, so that they actually finally led the Buddha to enlightenment. So each Jataka contains a story of such a bodhisattva, and each Jatak would generally start with, and this is generally, this is cannot be the rule of 550 Jatakas, but usually a Jatak story would start by a line saying that when Raja Brahmadatta was ruling Varanasi, Bodhisattva X or ABCD was born as XYZ. So this is how Jatak story would start. This is almost like saying, this does not refer to any king, but it is almost like saying once upon a time in wherever. So it's that. A Jatak story usually is composed of five parts. The first part is usually an incident in the life of the Buddha, which kind of sparks of or prompts the Buddha to narrate a Jatak. So that's the first part of the story, where there is an incident from the life of the Buddha. The second part is the incident that the Buddha is narrating from his previous life. Hmm? The third part of the story, which is the most important part, is called the Gatha, and it forms the core of this whole story. And perhaps the Gathas are also the oldest part of the story. Stories, as you know, get added to, modified, etc., in the course of time. But the Gatha, which is contained in the story, is the core of the story and the oldest part of the story. Hmm? Uh, so that's the third part. And then the last part actually is about uh, revealing characters from the previous life and relating them to the characters in the present life of Buddha. So he would say, in that story, this character was presently this. That character would be like, I was this, and my wife was this, and you were this, and you were that. So that revealing of characters is the fourth part of the story. So that's how a Jatak is composed. Right now, what you see on the slide is from Cave 1, and it's the story of the Mahajanak Jatak. Uh, as you can see roughly, as I said, the incidents are all mixed up. Most of the incidents that you see on this plate are incidents from the palace or concerned with the palace. On your extreme right is an incident that happens in the sea. I'll talk about that. So I'll quickly narrate what this Jatak is about. Hmm. So, as the story goes, uh, in the in the city of Mithila ruled a king called Mahajanak, and he had two sons, Arittajanak and Polajanak. Arittajanak was the elder son, and he became the king after his father, and Polajanak became his general. But somebody poisoned their minds, and Arittajanak banished Poljanak from his kingdom. Poljanak retaliated, and he amassed an army and defeated Arittajanak, rather killed him. But somehow his queen escaped, and she was pregnant at the time she escaped. And a Brahmin sheltered her in another city, Kal Champaknagar, and they lived there. And this boy grew up. This boy was also named Mahajanak after his grandfather, and he grew up to a young boy, uh, and he said that he will reclaim his father's lost kingdom. So, to amass wealth for reclaiming the kingdom, he set up on a voyage to Swarnabhumi to get gold, and he what boarded a ship. Now the ship sailed with uh, a huge speed and kind of broke up in the middle of the sea, and everybody started praying. But Mahajanak kind of did not uh, falter or did not pray, and he applied oil to his clothes, and he ate a lot of clarified butter mixed with sugar so that to sustain him. And he climbed the mast of the ship, and he jumped from the ship. Now, this painting on the left hand corner top, actually, it's a very broken painting, but you can see the ship there. Hmm? And the central figure there with the long hair is Mahajana. And the ship is kind of sailing, and I don't know whether it's breaking apart or not. The painting is quite deteriorated, but you can very vividly see the boat and the sails of the boat. So that's the incident depicted there, which is in one corner of the wall. Now he jumped and he swam for 7 days towards Mithila. Now, there was a guardian of the seas named Mani Mekhla, who had kind of the mandate of saving those who were dedicated to their parents. So this guy was dedicated to his mother, and he wanted to restore her past glory. And she kind of tested him, and this is where the gathas actually are recited. So she asks him a question, which is a gatha. So, for example, I'll read one of these gatha. It's a translation, it's a bad translation, but nevertheless, she asks him that who is this braving the seas, even if the shores are not seen? What do you bank on to fight on? So, this is a gatha in which she asks this question, and this Mahasattva, this prince, answers back saying that I completely realize the duties of a human being, and that makes me fight so, even if the shores are not seen. And she says that the seas are vast and the shores are not seen. Purusha, your efforts will die before reaching, efforts will be fruitless and you will die before reaching the shores. And he says that only he who makes all efforts to achieve his goals is freed from the debts to his gods, dear ones, and ancestors, and he never repents. So this conversation goes on, and this forms the core of this whole story, which is the Gatha. Hmm. So satisfied, this Mani Mekhala carries him like a garland of flowers and puts him in the garden in Mithila. And this is when this is happening, the king of Mithila, or this guy's uncle, Polajanak, has died, and he has a daughter whom he has left behind, and he has left behind a set of riddles to be solved, and whoever solved those riddles would be made the next king of Mithila. So the ministers have all tried in vain, and now the pradhan has, or the minister has kind of set foot to find one able person who can solve these riddles. And with a pushparath, he somehow comes to this garden, sees this young man sleeping under a tree. Uh, he finds this young man as remarkable. He asks him a few questions. Then he brings him to the palace. He solves the riddles, and then it's decided that he would be made the next king of Mithila. So the painting on the right, now that you see, is this Mahajanak is being bathed for coronation. So these are interpretations. I'm not 100% sure whether it's the same bathing that's happening, but these are interpretations. This could be wrong. But he is being bathed for being made ready for the coronation, and you can see the mandap which he is seated in. You can also see the kind of saurang that he's seated on. Then people are pouring water over him, perhaps milk and water together, whatnot. So this is the painting depicting his being made ready for becoming the king. So now he becomes the king. He marries this princess who is called Shivli Devi, Shivali Devi or Shivli Devi, and he starts ruling Mithila. One day he is roaming around in a mango grove, the royal groves, mango groves, and he sees a tree full of mango fruit, and he plucks a fruit and enjoys it, and he goes further on his walk. He also sees on his way another tree which does not have fruit but which has green leaves, and it's calmly standing in that grove. On his way back, he sees that the fruit laden tree has all been ripped off of its fruit, of its leaves, of its branches. It's destroyed. Somebody or many people perhaps have taken away everything that the tree had. But the other tree which did not have fruit is standing as it is. So that sets him thinking, and he kind of loses interest in whatever he has as a king. So he likens himself to the fruit laden tree. The painting at the left hand bottom actually shows that king in that thinking mode. So he has lost interest in whatever pleasures he has around him, So he has the queen kind of trying to entice him back into the worldly pleasures, but he is kind of looking lost. He's not even looking at the queen, but he is lost in his own thought. There are musicians, and then there is a dancer who is trying to kind of entice him back to this world, but he has set thinking already. Yeah, that's a close up. Yeah. So finally, what he does is he seeks the advice of a monk. And the left hand top painting in this plate uh, is where you see there is a monk who looks like Buddha. It's not Buddha, but who looks like Buddha. And Mahajanak sitting at his feet and raptly listening to what the monk has to say. So he listens to this sermon, and there is a painting which shows him going to this monk in a procession. So I have not kind of zoomed in on that part, but there is a painting of that as well. So he seeks advice, and then he makes up his mind to kind of leave everything behind and become an ascetic. That's when the queen again tries to reason with him of why not to do that. So the painting on the right is when the king has decided that he is going to renounce everything and lead a life of ascetic, and he is going to leave Mithila, is when the queen and the others are quite surprised. Again, it's not very clear in these pictures as to the emotions displayed on the faces of these ladies, but if you look very closely, or perhaps you can look it up on the net, these ladies have various expressions of surprise, disdain, sadness, etc., uh, uh, hearing the decision of the king. So that's the scene that is depicted on the right. And then, despite all the persuasions, the king decides to leave. So, the procession, he is leaving the gates of either the palace or the city on a horse. So, you see Mahajanak renouncing everything and going out of the city, leaving his kingdom on this painting at the left uh, side bottom. So he leaves, and I think this is where the paintings end. The story doesn't end here. The story goes on to say that he walks towards the Himalayas, and Shivli Devi kind of follows him. And then on his way, he meets a small girl who poses riddles to him to check whether he is really on the path of renunciation. And then he meets an arrow maker who again kind of checks whether he is really on the path of renunciation. And finally, Shivli Devi doesn't leave him. And finally, this guy has to kind of pick up a stick, break it into two, and say it's almost like what we say Kadi mode. So he says, now that this stick is broken, you and I are separate and we have to go our different paths, so leave me alone. So Shivli Devi kind of comes back, erects stupas on the way where he has met the arrow maker, where he has met the girl. So she builds stupas, and then she comes back to Mithila, and her son kind of takes over the kingdom, and she lives a life of an ascetic. This guy reaches the Himalayas in 7 days, and thus renounces the world. So now again coming back to this life, Buddha, who is explaining this story, says that I was Mahajanak, and Rahul's mother, that's Buddha's wife, was Shivli Devi. And then he explains that some Uppalpan or Anand, who are his disciples in this current birth, are the arrow maker and the girl and whatnot. So this is how this story of Mahajanak unfolds in these caves. So I think, yeah, that's a close-up of, as I said, the ladies which are bewildered. This is the close-up of the dancer who is trying to entice. Hmm. So with this, I think I'll end what I have to say about Ajanta. It has been a long time since I started talking, and I think, to say the least, is that it's a pride of India, I think, and one should be proud of Ajanta. One should go and visit it at least, uh, and do everything possible to conserve this. So that's it. Thank you so much.
Yes.
Saurabh,
So, am I audible?
is anybody there or is
Yes.
everybody gone?
No, 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 no. Everybody is there, and there are a lot of comments pouring in saying it was very wonderful session, insightful. There are two, three questions.
Hello.
Hello, hello.
Yes. I thought everybody is already gone or dozed off.
Am I audible?
Yes, yes.
Yes. So there are two, three questions. Now we can see you also, which are saying that this was a very wonderful session. And if you don't mind, we'll take up one or two questions from that. One is by Suvarna Vaze ma'am saying, do you have any idea where they must have put the dugout stone or the debris from the caves?
Yeah.
Hello? Are you there?
Yes, I don't have an idea, but if you look at Ajanta today, you don't see but it must have really created a hill out of whatever was dug out, but you don't see that nearby Ajanta. So, no, they must have disposed it of somewhere very thoughtfully.
Okay.
Yeah, there is a river, and if they would have deposited it there, as we do now, they would have stopped that river from flowing. But they haven't done that. They have deposited it somewhere which is not obtrusive. But I
Okay.
don't know where it is.
Okay. One question is, what is tempera painting? And are Ajanta paintings temperas then?
Hello, can you hear me
Yes.
or I can't hear
Yes,
you?
yes. Another question is asking what is tempera painting and are Ajanta questions tempera paintings?
Hello.
Yes, I can hear you.
काय? Hmm.
Hello. Sir, can you hear me?
काय question?
टेम्परा पेंटिंग्स अजंठाचे टेम्परा पेंटिंग्स आहेत का?
Okay, Saurabh, I guess there is a question. My daughter says there is a question here on Facebook. So, which asks, what is tempera painting?
Yes, 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 yes.
So, can you hear me?
Yes, very much.
So, tempera, काय?
येतंय ऐकू व्यवस्थित येतंय.
Yeah. So, tempera, Saurabh, your voice is breaking.
सर व्यवस्थित ऐकू
Yeah, I'll
येतंय.
answer whatever I have understood. Tempera painting is a technique.
I think we lost him. His connection is no more there. So I'll try to get him back if possible. Till then, please hold with us. I'm trying to get Sharvia sir back online. Till then, if you have any questions, just put them in the chat box. So we'll try to answer them. And if there's any problem of getting him back online, then we'll try to answer them on Facebook itself. Okay, there's some problem in connecting with him. So without him, I'll thank him here for being patient and giving us a talk, a wonderful session for more than 1 hour, 30 minutes, I'll say, about Ajanta and taking us virtually through the journey through Ajanta Caves. And once this lockdown thing is over, then we might plan a visit with him to the caves. So we look forward for everybody to be there with us. Ah, he's back. He's back. He's back. Yes, the journey through Ajanta Caves. And once this lockdown thing is over, then we might plan a visit with them to the
Hello,
caves.
disturb
So we look forward for everybody to be there with us. Ah, he's back. He's back. He's back. Okay. Uh, so can you hear me now?
मला ऐकू येत नाहीये पण अजूनही.
आता येतंय?
हा, येत आहे.
Yes. Temperas बद्दल question होता. So if you can answer that.
बोलू का नको?
बोला बोला. Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. हो हो.
Can you hear me, sir?
हा.
Temperas बद्दल question होता. What are
Okay,
temperas?
tempera is a kind of technique of painting, as I explained. When the lime surface which you paint on is dry. Sorry? So the lime surface on which you paint, when it is dry, and then you apply paint so that the lime does not absorb the paint. That technique is called a tempera painting. Whereas when the lime is wet, and if you paint on the lime when it is wet, so that the lime also absorbs the color, then it is called a fresco. Could you hear me or no?
Yes.
Okay, I'll answer again. Tempera painting is a technique of painting when the surface of the lime surface on which you are painting is completely dried, and then you paint so that the lime does not absorb the paint. That's called a tempera technique of painting. Fresco, on the other hand, is uh, uh, is a technique when you paint when the lime is wet, the lime absorbs the paint. So that's a fresco type of painting. So Ajanta paintings are tempera kind of paintings, not frescoes. So it's a misnomer, as I said, that you call these Ajanta paintings frescoes. They are not frescoes. It's a tempera painting.
Okay. Another question. Are working drawings of these caves made?
So Saurabh, does that answer your question? I mean, was that the question?
Yes, yes, yes. Okay. I think we'll end this session here. So rest of you all can put your questions in the chat box. We'll try to answer them as and when sir is available. and he can get back to you. Till then, thank you, sir, for this very informative session. And for people who are not members of Intact or who are not aware of Intact, we have a Facebook, Instagram page. So I request you to get connected with us. Uh, we'll be posting a lot of new things, new events coming up from Intact side on these pages. We also have a WhatsApp group with which you can get connected and be a part of Intact. Thank you very much.